Hello, everyone. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about African American classics. Now that you are winding up with the stories, and many of you are completing your first assignment, just wanted to sort of talk generally about the text with you. Um, First of all, you'll notice that a lot of the stories in African American classics dig deep into the African American folkloric tradition, and on some level or the other do some of the things that you expect from folklore. They teach some kind of a lesson. They have some sort of a moral tale as a part of it. There's some sort of a value, if you will, that's being asserted in these stories. And I really want you to focus on thinking about how these stories communicate certain values to you. The first of these is, of course, Florence Lewis Bentley's Two Americans, where one man forgives another man who lynched and burned his own brother. Think about how extraordinary that must be to do that. This man is also fighting for a country that will regard him as less than a man and will segregate him when he returns. The story is really one that teaches this tremendous value of love and forgiveness, all of which the central character does because the ghost of his brother, his lynched brother, communicates to him that he should do this. Um, W.E.B. Du Bois's story on being crazy is a interesting tale that has sort of a moral commentary in it about segregation. You have to consider when you read this one that Du Bois was a Northerner who first fully encountered Jim Crow when he attended Fisk. He appears almost as an alien in the story, arriving south and dealing with the absolute nonsense of Jim Crow. And I think the story effectively points out how nonsensical Jim Crow really is. There isn't any logical consistency to any of the principles of Jim Crow segregation. And the way that Du Bois, as a character within the story, encounters it really kind of brings that out for you. A Carnival Jangle by Alice Dunbar Nelson is interesting. This sort of meek character by the name of Flo becomes a troubadour at the suggestion of the Mephisto character. Now, one thing to always recognize about African American folklore and folkloric tropes is that the devil is always present in the story. The devil is as present as God might be. And this really comes from African American, or excuse me, West African spirituality and cosmology, which isn't afraid of dealing with devil characters, has them up front, and also has trickster characters that will put you in a situation where you're going to have to make a decision between one path or the other path, and one path might be the path of evil, and the other one might be the path of good. One might lead to life, and one of them might lead to death. And what happens to Flo here is that in the costume of the troubadour, she's confused for somebody else during Carnival and is killed. Now, this is interesting because, you ask why. Was she set up by Mephisto, who might have been a devil slash trickster figure, and maybe wanted to claim her soul as a devil figure? Or does the story on some level speak to the dangers of masking and seeking other identities? And that's worth your consideration. But either way, there's kind of a classic folkloric moral involved in there too. Lawing and Jawing is part of a couple of comedic pieces that are written by Zora Neale Hurston in this volume. You've got the corrupt and incorrigible judge who sentences everybody but the pretty women in his court. This is really a comedic riff on the arbitrariness of justice. And I know it was tough to read because, like a few stories here, you're dealing with black dialect, and you're wondering whether or not Zora Neale Hurston is making fun of her own people in one way or the other. The thing to keep in mind is that you're reading Harlem Renaissance writers here for the most part, and many Harlem Renaissance writers were trying to go back to the old folk bluesy roots of African American culture, and to lift up not only the comedy of them, but the pathos as well. So you got to take a little bit of that into account. Lex Talionis by Robert W. Bagnall is a fascinating story of revenge and race. It reminds me of a piece by the name of George Schuyler called Black No More. Here, a black chemist wreaks his revenge for the brutal death of his sister at the hands of a racist lawyer by turning that racist lawyer black with his chemicals. It's sort of the reverse of Black No More in the sense that Black No More is a fictional piece, a longer fictional piece about an African American who is able, through the use of science, to transform himself into a white person and to live as a real white person within society, in effect passing. And it's about some of the choices that he makes living as a white person in society. In this one, a white person is transformed into a black person and winds up being the victim of the very same kinds of hate that he perpetuates. So the lesson here, obviously, is a lesson about hatred and a lesson about vitriol and lynching and racism in and of itself. It's also interesting here that the black chemist uses science in order to teach this lesson about racism. The reason why that's interesting is because, as you know, early 19th and 20th century pseudosciences of the Enlightenment sought to use some kinds of scientific distinction to uphold theories of race. One of the most popular of these was the measuring of skull sizes. It's sort of a pseudoscience called phrenology. And the thinking with phrenologists was that if you could prove that blacks had smaller skull sizes, that it would then mean that they had smaller brains and were then less capable of doing the kinds of things that whites were capable of doing, of governing themselves, of voting, et cetera, and frankly of being free. So this story kind of turns that on its ear, because here you have a black scientist who has a real command of the science and finds some way to play around with race with his scientific concoctions. Um, on the matter of Two Men, James D. Carruthers, this is sort of an ode to, well, it's just really sort of a treatment of how the slave, in the end, despite his, and maybe because of his oppression, wins out. So while the master is getting fat and lazy and so forth and so on, the slave is preparing himself, strengthening himself in terms of his body and his soul. It's really one of those tortoise and the hare stories. He who appears to be last will sometimes finish first. Buyer of Dreams by Ethel M. Caution is a fascinating piece that cautions people about flighty, ephemeral dreaming, wishing for silly sorts of things. Here we have somebody at the end who wishes for at least what Ethel M. Caution will determine as the greatest value or the greatest dream. Not one of fame, not one of popularity, but one, in this case, of a woman who wants children. And there's nothing that's offered within the dream shop that can satisfy that for her. And this is a real dream of substance. It's her dream. The Goop-Herd Grapevine is a fascinating story by Charles W. Chestnut that involves a little bit of witchcraft and superstition. You see that in a few of the pieces here. Long story to summarize for you, but in the end, a tale of how a master, utilizing a conjure woman, first plays around with bewitching his crop so that his slaves can't eat any of the grapes. And the first thing that you think is, this is the parable of the stingy man. And it really is, because as you dig further into it, when he replaces one slave with another by the name of Henry, who then accidentally eats the grapes. He has to go back to the conjure woman, get a new spell. That new spell ties the grape crop to the health of the new slave, Henry, so that in the fall, when everything's been harvested, Henry goes back to being old and bald and sick and so forth and so on. And then as the grapes are growing up to their harvest, he becomes this younger, virile man with a lot of hair on his head and everything like that. But the master again continues to go too far with this and begins to manipulate his new slave, Henry, selling him right before he knows that his health will decline, and then buying him back right before he knows that his health will pick up again. And in the end, he is too clever for himself. He hires somebody from the north to give him a whole new system of working the grapes and a wine press and so forth and so on, and that destroys the crop. And the Master McAdoo, in the case of this story, winds up trying to wreak his revenge in the Civil War, taking it all out against the Northerners who, quote unquote, ripped him off. Really, he ripped himself off. It's like that old, I'm probably dating myself by saying this here, but it's like that old iced tea rap. You played yourself. And that's really what the moral of this particular story is. One of my favorites here is the last story, Shalmaneser by Francis E.W. Harper. In this one, Shalmaneser, this beautiful ebony prince, negotiates what the path of his life will be by pairing himself up with different women named for certain virtues: desire, pleasure, wealth, fame, and then finally peace and self-denial. And this is really a wonderful story that teaches people about the correct values to follow. After following pleasure and fame and wealth, and then winding up really sick in the end, it turns out that it's the sacrifice of self-denial who gives him her blood, who's willing to give her life for him to sustain him. That really is meaningful for Shalmaneser, and in the end speaks to the true value that he should have been looking for the whole time. This value of self-sacrifice. And you think about this because in the course of the story, all of the values that are raised by these folkloric tales, in one way or the other, reinforce the fundamental values that you have to have in order to hold a community together. You can't be chasing wealth, you can't be chasing fame and fortune. You have to be chasing something that holds people together. Whether it's the story about the dreams where the young woman decides that she's going to value children, or Shalmaneser here where he values self-sacrifice, giving himself to others. There are a couple others that are like that too that are worth mentioning. One of these, and I'll end with this, is The Filling Station, again by Zora Neale Hurston. This is a comedy of, ultimately a comedy of two black men at a filling station arguing about things like which of their states, Georgia or Alabama, has the better white men, which of their cars is better, Chevy or Ford. And neither one of them are invested in either company, Chevy or Ford, nor do they have any kind of serious investment in the white men in the states of Georgia and Alabama, both of whom treat them horribly and have imposed them under Jim Crow laws. But the story, in its own comedic way, speaks to those moments when we tend to look away from what the real values are supposed to be, what we're supposed to be focused on. You have two guys here who are at the point of coming to blows and hurting one another and arguing about stupid stuff. Which white men are better in the system of segregation. It's complete and utter nonsense. But in a comedic way, Zora Neale Hurston does the same sort of thing that happens for you in the story Shalmaneser. She points out what values are really most important. The other thing that I think that she points out very well here is the degree to which division and in this case, a petty state line division, because in the final frame of the piece, you come to understand that the filling station sits at the state boundaries between Alabama and Georgia. And she's pointing out to you the degree to which these two black men are so willing to get invested in state boundaries and state identity. And there really is a much broader identity for them to get involved in. In her own way, it's kind of a parable that warns you about things like Crips versus Bloods, or about blacks from one neighborhood going to fight blacks from another neighborhood. And frankly, owning neither neighborhood, or having no real financial interest in any of these things, but simply fighting and arguing because there's a difference that can be made between the two of them. So anyways, I hope you found African American classics, graphic classics, to be as fascinating as I did, and a good introduction to this early literature, in this case literature of the Harlem Renaissance. I do want to say, as a final word, that one of the reasons why I wanted to assign this kind of text is because, for me, the graphic novel is the ultimate in the democratic art form. I think it really brings a larger audience in by appealing to a more visual culture, which we are now. It brings a larger audience in to reading classic literature. And in this way, especially if you think about the morals that are involved in each of these tales, in this way, it gets us invested in how people have been thinking about these things, maybe since the 1920s and the 1930s. And a lot of these morals and lessons that we find in these pieces are still relevant today. Anyways, thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to reading all your pieces tomorrow. Take care, and you'll hear from me in the next video about our next novel very soon.